Okay, so my name is Cassie Westmoreland. We have our ESG team here with us today to do this quick and hopefully easy ESG Emergency Solutions Grants Program overview. This is for folks who are new to our ESG program, folks who have had ESG for a while, and also just as a training opportunity to make sure that we are all on the same page and using these funds appropriately. Just a note, and we will touch on this as we go through the presentation. These regulations will be different from the ESG CV regulations, which are the ESG funds that come through the CARES Act to us as the Division of Housing. This is just specifically for the regular ESG funding that we are allocated every year. So just a quick note on the agenda. We're going to start with the Office of Homeless Initiatives overview and philosophy for how we want to incorporate emergency solutions grants into our overall strategy in response to homelessness across the state of Colorado. We're going to talk about partners who's involved in ESG, what that looks like. We're going to clarify those ESG requirements, really looking at what will be expected of you all as potential recipients of these funds, and then clarify some next steps and again, touch on those ESG CV nuances. So before we get into that, I want to introduce Erica, who's our wonderful HUD TA provider, who will be taking some of the bulk of the regulation portions of this. But Erica, would you mind just saying hi and telling us what your involvement in ESG is and how we can use HUD TA as a resource for ESG?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Erica Snyder. I provide HUD technical assistance around the Emergency Solutions Grant and ESG CV. I'm working directly with the state of Colorado around strategy and planning for ESG CV so that we can use this to catalyze your homeless response system and effectively address homelessness. I am available when there's specific questions about the rules and the regulations, as well as for capacity building and training needs, and working with the state to determine how they could best organize and coordinate with all of you. So it's wonderful to meet everyone today, and I look forward to talking with you all in just a few moments.
Awesome. Thank you, Erica. Okay, so let's just jump in really quickly to an introduction overview. So again, learning objectives for all of the ESG recipients, whether you're an active recipient or a potential recipient, to fully understand the expectations of what it takes to administer ESG, know how to ping us when you do have questions, and then contribute to the overall improvement of our oversight of this program, ultimately with the goal for having homelessness in Colorado be rare, brief, and one time if it does occur. This leans into OHI's, Office of Homeless Initiatives, OHI's larger goal of making homelessness history in Colorado. And so our vision really is that every Coloradan has a safe, stable, and affordable place to live. Obviously, ESG is not the only component of that. We have other funding sources and strategies as well. The ESG is one of our largest funding opportunities, specifically for shelter and outreach and those sorts of activities. And then, of course, moving into prevention and rapid rehousing. We will dig into that in just a little bit, but just to kind of connect this to the larger overarching goals of OHI. And so again, here, just really looking at what are our strategies in order to make homelessness history in Colorado. So we really want to create a future and a system where it is brief and rare when it does occur, and that no one gets left behind, that there aren't folks out there who don't have options in our continuum of homelessness response. So we've got some key goals listed here. These are really going to be the underlying philosophy of all of OHI's programs, so including ESG. So stop homelessness before it starts, if that's at all possible. Identify individuals who are at risk and ensure that they're safe. Connect people with the solutions they need to quickly exit homelessness. So that really speaks to that person-centered component of how we use these funds and making sure that they're targeted to each individual or household as needed in that moment. And then create access to long-term structural solutions, right? So how do you end homelessness? It's housing. It's housing and the supportive services that are required to keep people in that housing. So just want to highlight here the conversation around equity and inclusion, and really understanding this link between knowledge and understanding, the idea of what equity and inclusion are, and then how they look in practice, right? So understanding, to touch on these bullet points, knowing that there's a well-established link between health and housing, that if you don't have housing, you have worse health outcomes as well. Housing disparities are pervasive across race and ethnicity due to that institutional racism and structural component that is underlying all of this. And that are the decisions that we make as funders, as program providers, as practitioners, they matter. They matter in terms of the geographic health and equity across the board. So thank you all for doing that work. And then, in terms of practice, what does this look like? How are we going to move from just having this knowledge around equity and inclusion and really turning it into practice? And that's part of what we're working to do with our ESG program as well as our other OHI programs. And so some of these bullets, obviously they'll look different as you all are implementing them or as they're implemented across different parts of the state. But really making sure that we're centering racial and ethnic equality in our program design and evaluation, right? It's not just, okay, we've done it, check, but how are we continually making sure that that underlying methodology is a component of our program evaluation as well? Continually assessing organizational biases and practices to make sure that there's nothing that we're inadvertently doing that's keeping people who might need access to services from being able to access them. Promoting expertise, leadership, and engagement of individuals with lived experiences. We talk about this one a lot in homelessness specifically. So making sure that, if it's about us, without us, it's not for us, right? So who is the us in that situation, and how are we making sure that what we are doing includes them in these decision-making processes and make sure that we, as the overseers of this funding, are not inadvertently creating barriers for those folks who we're trying to help. And then building a broad coalition of partners. We can't know everything. Even as we bring people with lived experience into these conversations, they aren't going to know everything either. And so how are we really collaborating across homelessness responses to make sure that we're not missing anything and that we're open to hearing that feedback and criticism and changing the way that we are practicing with these funds to ensure a continual philosophy of improvement and program development and inclusion across the board. Another really important component of OHI's philosophies are data and using real-time person-specific data to help communities and organizations understand the scale of homelessness so as to effectively respond. I think right now we're in COVID times, and so we do have a lot more money than we usually do, but even the large increase that we have is not enough to meet homelessness for everyone, or to end homelessness for everyone, excuse me. And so how are we being intentional with those funds? How are we using data to really make sure that we're measuring the impact that we're having? This does obviously touch back to the previous slide around racial, ethnic, geographic, and other inequalities that exist, but also to talk about improving accountability and transparency. How do we know that the investments that we're making are effective investments and are leading to the systematic ending of homelessness in Colorado? Anybody who does the point in time count knows that the challenges with getting a complete picture of homelessness, it's almost insurmountable. It changes every day. It changes. It feels like it can change by the minute with people cycling in and out of these systems. So really making sure that we have that real-time data to help us understand what it looks like, and also just to help us create that shared understanding of what people are actually needing and how our prioritization of resources meets what people are needing in a real-time way. That leads into, if you're familiar with coordinated entry, you've heard of the by name list, making sure that we know people by name, know where they are. Those data points are really important to help the system be able to be flexible and creative and responsive. Helping our organizations with this shared information so that we all can be coordinating the plans and building adequate systems. There's not going to be one individual who is doing this or one individual agency who is doing this by themselves, but really how are we all working with the same set of data to make sure that the system that we're creating across the board meets the needs of people. So in Colorado, for example, we're working with Community Solutions and the Built for Zero team to make sure that our data infrastructure is up to date, is real time, is flexible, so that our systematic response is using that data and is using that picture and is using the most up-to-date information available to respond to homelessness as it exists right now in this moment. Another really important piece of this is to understand, as we're collaborating with other organizations or partner agencies, how do our services interact with our partner services? How do they work together, or where are we inadvertently creating barriers and gaps for people, right? So as people are coming into shelters, where are they going to on the back end of that shelter capacity? Having that understanding of how the system looks across the board will help us to make sure that we're not just creating levels of homelessness for people, right? Where they come to our shelter and they're housed, and that's great, and then are they back in housing, or are they back in homelessness a year later? If so, have we really accomplished that mission of ending homelessness for people? Streamlining services, obviously this one is a really straightforward one when it comes to data. Preventing those inefficiencies and duplications of, if agency A is doing this, do we need agency A to do the same thing, or do we want do we need agency B to do the same thing, or do we want agency B to complement what agency A is doing? And how are agency A and B working together to understand what the other is doing so that they aren't duplicating and that there's an efficient partnership there? The way in which we at the Office of Homeless Initiatives are going to rely on data is to make sure that we're implementing evidence-based practices and that we're only funding evidence-based programs. So we know, because of your data, that you are actually contributing to ending homelessness, as opposed to being part of a system that doesn't actually end homelessness for people. And this, of course, leads into funding decisions and programmatic policies and priorities, but it can also be leveraged to build those cross-sector partnerships, right? If we don't understand how homelessness impacts Medicaid, for example, we're missing a partnership there. If we don't understand how homelessness impacts criminal justice systems or health and human services, or these other agencies who are trying to work to support our communities, we could be missing those partnerships and leveraging those additional resources towards this large system. So obviously the main way that we utilize data right now is through HMIS, Homelessness Management Information Systems, or CAFE, if you're one of our victim service provider partners. But moving more towards not just having those systems be used as a reporting mechanism, because HUD says that we have to, but really being able to utilize those systems flexibly and creatively so as to get the data that we as homeless service providers need to better serve our folks is the ultimate goal here. So we can't get too far into Ojai philosophies without talking about housing first. So the definition, there's lots of definitions of housing first out there. What we as in Ojai are using when we say housing first is this radical idea that housing is what ends homelessness, and that it's not just housing, right? It's housing first, and then immediate connection to services that help keep people in housing, regardless of what challenges or barriers or vulnerabilities that individual or household has. So it's a proven best practice. There are some statistics right there about how 98%, studies show that 98% of folks in housing first programs have housing retention up to a year later. Those numbers do drop off a bit when you look a few years out, but that's still a pretty striking number when you look at that first year. And then of course for rapid rehousing models, there's that higher success when they're using housing first philosophy in the rapid rehousing. So it doesn't have to just be permanent supportive housing, right? This time limited voucher with all of the services, that's not the only way that housing first can manifest, but really how are we building that philosophy into the underlying programs that we have across the board, from street outreach to shelter to prevention to rapid rehousing and to PSH. So just a couple of pieces about that to clarify here. So the idea of housing first is that you position housing as an immediate priority for people experiencing homelessness. That's that switch from, making sure that people are housing ready. I'm using air quotes, but you can't see me. That housing ready piece is saying, like, okay, you can have housing when you're sober. You can have housing when you have a job. You can have housing when insert whatever precondition here. That is not something that we as housed individuals expect of ourselves or our neighbors. And so why is it something that we are expecting from folks who are experiencing homelessness, arguably the people who should be prioritized for housing immediately? It quickly connects people to permanent housing, permanent here being defined as non-time limited, So a lease that they can have their name on, a voucher that they have access to that they can utilize without that, 90-day, 2-year, whatever time period it might be. And then the other piece is with those voluntary services, right? It's not housing first. It's not housing only. It's housing first. But we don't require that folks engage in services in order to get that housing. They are housed, and then we start to talk about how do we keep you housed? How do we help you figure out whatever it is that led to homelessness in the first place and work around that so that you don't have to experience homelessness again. And again, it's not just an individual or agency philosophy, but a system-wide approach. It manifests, housing first as a philosophy manifests across every program that we want to be funding. And then obviously you can talk about housing first as a model in the individual program level. But housing first, kind of capital H, capital F, is a philosophy that guides the way in which we engage with people to help us be housing focused as a system of response. So just a couple of complementing approaches to housing first that help us achieve that mission. So housing focused programming, right? If you're not talking about housing from the moment you engage with someone, what are you talking about, right? If we're talking about, mental health services are great and substance abuse services are great, and all of those things are very important to a lot of the people that we serve. And how are we going to make sure that they get those services if they're not in housing, right? Housing readiness is something that people talk about a lot too. Well, they're not ready for housing just yet. Well, have you asked them? Have you talked with them about housing? And have you offered them housing without preconditions? A lot of times what we hear is that people turn down housing, but they turn down the preconditions of those housing. They don't actually turn down the 4 walls and the roof and the locked door, right? So how are we making sure that even in the language that we're asking and we're talking with people, that we are focusing on getting them connected to housing and helping them understand that it's housing without those preconditions that have usually jeopardized their housing in the past. Being low barrier builds right off of that. Understanding, especially for our folks who are living out of doors homeless, that there are probably a lot of big behaviors in that population, and there are a lot of challenges in that population. And that does not mean that somebody should not have access to these services. So how are we as a system removing those barriers to engaging with folks? The classic example that I like to give, I come from a shelter background, so the classic example that I like to give is understanding that you might not want weapons in your emergency shelter, but somebody might not want to give up that weapon that they have because that's safety for them when they are out of doors. So how do you work with that person to let them into your shelter and still be safe, right? So how do you have security lockers where people, amnesty lockers is another way that we call them, where folks can come in, and if they have things that they know aren't allowed in the shelter space, that doesn't mean they don't get access to shelter. That means they put it in amnesty locker, they can get it as they leave the shelter, but that does not bar them from being able to be in shelter that evening, right? Another one that we talk about a lot in shelters is pets. If you have a pet, I have a pet, and I would do anything to make sure that I didn't have to give up my pet in order to do anything. And so what sorts of barriers are we putting into place because we can't deal with pets or we don't have a pet-friendly space? What sorts of barriers are we putting up for people who rely on those pets as their security or their safety or their community? Progressive engagement, really looking at how we connect with person-centered services rather than just doing the same thing for every individual and household, because that's what the model says, right? This one manifests a lot in rapid rehousing. So making sure that we're engaging with people and giving them, instead of throwing everything at them all at once, let's see what we can do in terms of rental assistance. And if we give an amount of rental assistance and it doesn't work, how are we as a system responding and updating what we're providing, as opposed to demanding that every household and individual just fit what we're doing because it's easier for us administratively. It's really looking at that person-centered model and figuring out what it's going to take for each individual and household to not lose housing. All of this has to be trauma-informed. realizing and honoring that trauma has a physical manifestation in all of us, not just our unhoused neighbors, but that might manifest, and that might mean big behaviors, and again, using air quotes, but challenging behaviors. So how are we and our staff informed of how that trauma will manifest for people? I saw a survey once that said 92% of women who are experiencing homelessness have been assaulted either physically or sexually. That's going to manifest for people. And how are we as systems being responsive so that those folks feel comfortable and safe engaging with us? Thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? They're never going to be able to move on to security and self-actualization if they don't have that underlying foundation of safety. Part of being trauma informed means understanding harm reduction, and that really what we are trying to do is reduce the harm for people. This would manifest a lot with substance use, right? So if someone is drinking a handle of vodka every night, getting them to move to beer or wine or some other softer substance is going to be a step towards harm reduction for them. Does it get them to sobriety? No. But does that mean that we don't start working with them and start engaging with them and start trying to get them towards that harm reduction and to doing less harm? I think it's also important on this one to point out that we all, as housed individuals, engage in harm reduction every day. The next time you get in a car and you put your seatbelt on, you're still in a death trap that could actively kill you any moment. And that seatbelt and those airbags and our stop signs and our safety requirements for roads and bridges and those sorts of things are harm reduction. The next time you're at the beach and you put sunscreen on to keep from getting cancer, that is harm reduction, that you are still at risk of harm. And you are actively engaging in things that are going to reduce that harm for you. And so how do we make sure that we pass that grace and understanding on to folks whose behaviors we might not understand or agree with, but who still deserve that same dignity and respect that we give ourselves when we make risky decisions? And of course, there are other things that go into this: motivational interviewing, strengths-based practices, individual choice, all of that great stuff. Is part of all of these things that we've been talking about, and part of OHI's overarching philosophies for how we deal with homelessness. And these approaches should be reflected in practices and in policies and procedures, right? Going back to that first page around the difference between knowledge and practice. We can't just talk this talk, we have to walk this walk and be open to understanding and continually evaluating if this is happening for us in our programs. So who are our partners in this work? First and foremost, everyone listening to this webinar, everyone in the homelessness response system, you all are boots on the ground doing this work, and we at the state just want to say thank you for that. We're just providing the funding and resources, and you guys are taking that and actually doing the work. And we as a state would not be able to end homelessness without you all, so thank you for that. This image here is just a quick kind of categorization of what the system looks like. So obviously, starting from left to right, we've got prevention and diversion, trying to end homelessness before it happens, moving into a coordinated response to homelessness, whether that's outreach, shelter, emergency, rental assistance, transitional housing, bridge housing, all of these housing options as a continuum of services for people, where coordinated entry helps us to make sure that we're connecting the right folks to the right resource and to the right service. And then moving on towards affordable rental housing without support or with continued support, whatever that looks like for people. And then ultimately home ownership. That might not be feasible for every person that we're working with, but that being the ultimate goal for all Coloradans, right? Our huge partners are also the continuum of care. So in Colorado, we have 4 COCs or continuums of care through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is HUD. And they're designed to promote community-wide approaches to ending homelessness. So to help us do some of this organizing and collaborating to provide coordination for those services through the coordinated entry systems. So if you're in our balance of state continuum of care, you're probably working with a regional COC. We've got about 11 regional COCs, I believe. I don't have that number off the top of my head, so I apologize if that's wrong. And then operating and maintaining the data management system that feeds back into our understanding and data-driven continuum of responses. So that being the HMIS system, and of course, with CAFE for our victim service providers who can't use HMIS. So here's a map of the continuums of care. You can see the regional ones are the colorful ones, and then we've got, and that's the balanced state. And then we've got Northern Colorado, El Paso, Pikes Peak continuum of care, and the Metro Denver area. So that's just a quick map there. And if you are not sure who your continuum of care is, please feel free to reach out to us after this webinar and we can get you connected. So what does the COC involvement look like for our ESG grantees? So it's actually a requirement of HUD that ESG recipients and subrecipients. So we at the Division of Housing are recipients. You all are our subrecipients if you're receiving ESG money directly from us. It's a requirement for all of us to work with the COCs to make sure that there is a coordinated community approach to ending homelessness, is what we've been talking about this whole time. As the ESG recipient, Colorado will coordinate with the COCs to coordinate with them to determine funding allocations, to do HMIS coordination, performance measures. We want to be working with our COC partners to make sure we're all moving in the right direction toward that coordination. And then ESG grantees must also coordinate within the COC for their geographic area to make sure that coordinated entry systems and coordinated housing referrals are happening based on vulnerability. Most of us in Colorado are using the VI SPDAT, the Vulnerability Index Service Prioritization Decision and Assessment Tool, which helps us create that objective by name list of people based on that vulnerability. We also work with them to set up HMIS and coordinate really closely with our wonderful HMIS leads across the state, and then also to have a community plan for homelessness response and overall prevention efforts. So our COC partners are huge in this, and thank you if you guys are listening to this recording as well. And then, of course, for the Division of Housing, we have what we call ESG fiscal agents. Right now, the majority of our fiscal agents are actually our COC partners, but it can be anybody who takes our ESG money and then passes that on to another recipient in the form of a contract or a grant agreement. This is just kind of giving an outline for what we're expecting of our fiscal agents. So it's the same type of stuff that we as the Division of Housing do for any other recipient. So looking at overseeing the process for applying and contracting for ESG activities, making sure that it's open and fair and meets the state's procurement guidelines, and that those contracts that are in place fall in line with ESG eligible regulations and then state contracting as well. Providing that technical assistance to the sub-grantees to make sure that the folks with whom you're contracted are doing ESG in ways that obviously meet HUD regs, but also align with OHI's overarching philosophies. Accounting, right? That's a less fun version of this work, but really, really important, making sure that all of the accounts are properly segregated from grant funds to matching funds to other funds associated with the project, making sure that matching funds are eligible and are spent within the right time frame. And again, all of that work that we as the direct recipient also do to make sure that any funding coming to these programs is allocated appropriately, tracked, measured, all of that stuff. Auditing and monitoring, making sure that any grants that you pass along, that those folks have appropriate case files and documentation, doing that audit that aligns with the state's policies and procedures and your policies and procedures as well, and then reporting. So as the fiscal agent, you report on behalf of all of the folks to whom you subgrant. So financial status, looking at the overall budget, the performance measures, and then of course HMIS, data collection and evaluation, or again, CAFE if you are a comparable, if you are a victim service provider. So just a couple of points about some of the required elements for receiving ESG. These are HUD mandated policies and procedures, and unfortunately there is nothing that we can do about it as the state except for to help you set them up. So coordinated entry, being a process developed to ensure that all people experiencing any sort of housing crisis have the same access to the resources that are available. Really, this is to make sure that family A doesn't get a resource just because they went to the right agency at the right point in their funding cycle and talked to the right case manager. Right, we want to make sure that it's an objective system that connects the most vulnerable with the appropriate available resource. All ESG funded programs must participate in the coordinated entry system. This is linking back to that coordination between COCs and ESG, as well as other stakeholders who might not have federal funding but are still part of the as part of the homeless response system. And then again, making sure that we have that robust data around who is homeless, what do they need, what is this looking like, and how are we all as providers contributing to the same picture of homelessness by contributing our data to one consolidated place so that we all can look at trends and make sure that the overall system is more equitable and that those being served are being served appropriately and well. Obviously, for victim service providers, coordinated entry can be a bit of a challenge. Again, victim service providers being anyone who is serving folks fleeing from domestic violence. So there are additional protections around those folks, and they actually legally cannot enter information into HMIS. And so that's part of what we work through as the state with the regional planning entities who are doing coordinated entry, making sure that we're protecting them and adhering to that legality of not having them be in HMIS, but that does not mean that that's a barrier for them to access funding for housing that's flowing through COCs. So there are many ways that communities have gotten around, have figured out workarounds for this system. If you are a victim service provider and you're not connected to your coordinated entry system, please reach out and let us know, and we will connect you to that system. Part of that is by using the comparable database, which is the CAFE system for the state of Colorado, which adheres to those security requirements to make sure that folks aren't, that we don't collect their data in any compromising way. So again, thank you to our victim service providers who are have even more bureaucratic barriers to serving people, but are still doing that work every day. And like I said, if you are a victim service provider and you don't have access to CAFE, or you don't have access to coordinated entry or your COC, just reach out and we will get you connected to those systems. Okay, I'm going to stop talking now. I'm going to pass it over to Erica to really dig into some of the ESG requirements and regulations and all of that fun stuff.
Great, thanks, Cassie. So these are probably the things that you never thought you always knew you always wanted to know. We're going to cover the ESG regulations. And so the first place that we start is really with the interim rule. And that was passed back in January 2012. It transitioned the Emergency Shelter Grant to Emergency Solutions Grant, focusing on how do we stably house precariously housed or currently unhoused individuals. And within that, it changed the name. It also added in rapid rehousing as an eligible funding activity. Based upon the research, it showed that that was very effective. And so now HUD was funding it. And it changed some funding limits. This is a formula grant, so making sure that that was all aligned, and defined the at-risk of homelessness for ESG programs. At the same time, the final rule on the definition of homelessness went into effect, and it clarified who is homeless for HUD programs and what are those record-keeping requirements to make sure that everything is buttoned up from a monitoring perspective. Now, you heard me mention that this is a part of a formula grant, which falls within the consolidated plan, or it's called the CON plan. This is essentially a document for the 5 years that lays out strategies for low to moderate income households based off of their community needs, and a very robust community dialogue to determine those needs all throughout the state. And that is really focused on different domains related to housing, homelessness, economic development, infrastructure, etc. Except for Emergency Solutions Grant focuses on specifically homelessness. And there's an annual action plan that links those allocations and priorities and goals to the funding to address those needs. So ideally at the end of 5 years, we've seen progress and impact throughout the state. The strategic plan specifically within the consolidated plan focuses on housing and community development objectives. And within that, the ESG recipient, which is the state of Colorado, or DOLA here, must have additional information and provide and collaborate with all of you to make sure the CON plan covers the allocation of the resources, the performance standards, so what are things that people are going to be held accountable to, how is it going to be evaluated, as well as funding policies and procedures for HMIS. So I'm going to move us into talking about the eligible activities and program components. As a disclaimer up front, this is going to be high level, but additional detail is available, one through HUD, through the federal regulations, and numerous resources. So please, if you have specific questions, feel free to reach out to your partners at the state, and we can help make sure that you find the adequate background information to answer those questions. So first and foremost, we'll start with a very high-level overview of the homelessness definition. In 2012, it was broken into 4 categories. The first category being literally homeless individuals or families. The second category focusing around those who are imminently losing their primary nighttime residence or at risk. Category 3 relates to unaccompanied youth or families with youth and children who meet the homeless definition under other federal statutes, such as McKinney-Vento. And category 4 really relates to individuals and families fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, and other victims of violence fall within that category as well. When we're looking at the eligible components in admin, we've developed a chart on the next slide that really indicates what component is funded through ESG and who it can serve. And so for that, first is street outreach, which is reaching out to unsheltered homeless individuals and families, connecting them with emergency shelter, with housing, critical services, and providing them with urgent non-facility-based care, because you're literally out in the community on the street providing those services. Emergency shelters, providing temporary housing with services to those who've been experiencing homelessness. Homelessness prevention, it includes relocation and stabilization services, as well as short and medium-term rental assistance to prevent that individual or family from becoming homelessness, either helping them stabilize in their current unit or finding a more acceptable unit for them to be stabilized in long term. And then rapid rehousing also provides housing relocation and stabilization services, short-term and or medium-term rental assistance as needed to help individuals or families who are living in shelters or places not meant for human habitation to move as quickly as possible into permanent housing and achieve stability. There's also funding available for Homeless Management Information System, or HMIS, as well as your comparable database, if that's what you're using. And that covers the cost of participating in an existing HMIS for your COC, where the project is located, and some other activities. And then lastly is administration. So for the general management, oversight, coordination, and reporting on the program. And we're going to cover all of this in additional detail. So moving first into street outreach and the emergency shelter component, since there are some overlaps and different things within there. First, for street outreach, it serves your unsheltered homeless persons, or category 1 of that homeless definition I mentioned. These essential services that are the broad categories for those include engagement, case management, emergency health and mental health services, transportation, and services for special populations, which are spelled out on the screen in front of you. Within each one of those services, there are additional eligible costs, and if you have questions around those, please reach out and more information can be provided. As it relates to emergency shelter, this can serve any of the categories of the homeless definition, categories 1 through 4, individuals and families. For these are essential services that are being provided to people in the emergency shelters, but it also includes renovation of buildings to be used in emergency shelter, actually operating the shelter, and then any staff costs should be related to those activities, and they are eligible. And so there's 3 predominant buckets that we think of within this. So essential services to person in emergency shelter, which I'll go in subsequent slides, but that includes case management, employment assistance and job training, life skills, and more. For shelter operations, think of things such as covering the rent for the building, furnishings for the shelter, maintenance, covering utilities for the shelter, food for the residents and others who might be coming in, such as those who are involved in street outreach, supplies to operate the shelter, and more. Renovation is specifically related to the labor, the materials, the tools that are all required to rehabilitate or renovate the building so that it can become an emergency shelter. And we've created a chart that really shows you a comparison of those essential services between street outreach and emergency shelter services. So you'll see that there are things that are very similar and things that are different. But I think it's important to note that the key difference between these 2 components relates to who they're actually serving. So for street outreach, that includes services targeted to persons who are literally on the streets, right then and there. And that's where you're providing those services. Whereas emergency shelter is targeted to people who are still homeless, but they are staying within your emergency shelter. And there are some nuances between these different groups. So for instance, I like to highlight case management. That's an eligible component within both of these activities, but it looks a little bit different. So case management under street outreach is designed to meet the needs of those, or the emergency needs, I should say, of those who are literally homeless, and link them with shelter and services. Or if you can link them directly to housing, that's great as well. But it's to solve that emergency crisis there. Case management within an emergency shelter is geared towards the longer term needs of people. It should be housing focused. How do we help you move as quickly from shelter into your own permanent housing? And making sure that they're equipped with the other needs that they have, such as life skills, mental health services, etc. Emergency shelter and street outreach, there's some essential service definitions and distinctions, but ultimately what I think you could take away is that there are unsheltered individuals or walking clients who may not be able to be served within those essential services components, meaning you can't case manage somebody outside of the shelter who's literally homeless, because that would fall within street outreach. But you can still, if you offer, say, a lunchtime meal, folks who are experiencing homelessness on the street can come in and partake in that meal. So there are some nuances there, but those activities, the actual case management and other things need to be reserved for the proper component, and that's how the individuals are served. When considering the minimum period of use, this is fairly simple, I hope, in that if you're being funded for street outreach for 12 months, you need to be prepared and equipped to provide street outreach for 12 months. The same goes for emergency shelter, and it needs to be used solely for those essential services and shelter operations, and needs to be available to provide to individuals in that period of time in which you are funded. Moving on to homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing components. Starting first with prevention being defined and its purpose. I would say this is an area that there's a lot of general confusion, or the assumption that eviction prevention is the same as homelessness prevention. And what we hope is that you can see that it's a much broader area for homelessness prevention, and that it's really meant specifically to prevent people who are currently housed from becoming homeless, and help them to regain stability within either their current home or other permanent housing. And but for this assistance, but for this ESG intervention, they would experience homelessness. That there's a lot, especially within eviction prevention, people might have other resources, things, other avenues. They could stay with family, they could stay with friends, they could be more creative. The purpose of homelessness prevention is to say this is their last stop from them experiencing homelessness, and this is why they need assistance. Within that, the eligible participants within individual families who are at imminent risk or at risk of homelessness are categories 2, 3, and 4 fall within that. I would also say category 1C for homelessness counts. But those 3 categories you see up there are ones that are used very often. And with homelessness prevention, there's an initial evaluation or an intake. And the household you're serving must have an income below 30% area median income, and lack the resources or support networks to help them retain or obtain appropriate housing. And when I'm talking about area median income, I'm talking exclusively about annual ESG in these slides, and not ESG CV. So for homelessness prevention, there is a reassessment that's required every 3 months. That's to maintain people are still eligible. And in order to continue to receive homelessness prevention services, they must have an annual income below 30% of annual AMI and lack the resources to either retain their housing or find other appropriate housing. Our goal is to have people exceed 30% AMI to move on and be successfully housed, but should they take a longer period of time for stability within homelessness prevention, they still need to meet that initial criteria at entry. For rapid rehousing, this is a purpose specifically for people who are currently living in the streets, living in emergency shelter, who've been experiencing homelessness, and help them transition as quickly as possible, or rapidly, if you will, into permanent housing, and to have them achieve stability. So the work doesn't stop just when individuals receive housing, but actually making sure individuals have that ability to develop skills, to know the resources, to be connected in the community so that they can maintain that housing long term. The eligible participants for this are category 1, people who are literally homeless, and Category 4, those who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence in that particular way. And I think please keep in mind for rapid rehousing, there is not an income threshold at initial eligibility. Anybody experiencing homelessness, regardless of their area median income, can receive rapid rehousing assistance, unlike homelessness prevention where there is that initially. For the reassessment for rapid rehousing, this is required annually, once a year, and at that point in time is when you look at income. And the individuals or families must have income at or below 30% area median income or AMI and lack the resources and support networks to help them retain or obtain appropriate housing. So you'll see similar lingo to prevention, but it's just done 1 year in for rapid rehousing. Now, looking at the eligible assistance for homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing, they are one and the same, meaning financial assistance can cover moving costs, security deposits, last month's rent. I'm going to go into more detail of these on the upcoming slides. And then services are named the same. So there's housing search and placement search, that initial piece where you're trying to make sure that either people can live in their current unit or find them a new one. And then housing stability case management is when it's a different set of work, but it's very important to make sure people have the skills and tools to stay in their own home and ideally not need your services ever again. The next slide will show that the eligible assistance, so housing relocation and stabilization services are available up to 24 months of that assistance, meaning if the rental assistance stops, you can still engage in case management past that point. Participants are encouraged to meet with their case manager at least once a month during the duration of this assistance, and there can be exceptions as it relates to VAWA or others that prohibit that conditional upon the receipt of services, conditional housing. Short-term rental assistance is for up to 3 months, and that might be just for households who need a lower level of assistance that they can stabilize relatively quickly. Medium-term rental assistance is from 4 to 24 months, so up to 2 years. And then the payment of rental arrears is a one-time payment of up to 6 months, and this can include late fees. And when you're looking at those 3 types of rental assistance, be that short-term, medium-term, or arrears, the total cannot exceed 24 months during any 3-year period. So that's just important to note that looking at times, that's what you have a 3-year runway to use those 24 months of assistance. When you're looking at rental application fees, those are the fees that's charged by the owner or property manager to all applicants to apply for the unit. Security deposits can equal no more than 2 months rent, according to the federal regs. You can provide last month's rent when you pay first month's rent in the security deposit. And then moving costs are allowable, such as a truck rental or hiring a moving company, and then certain temporary storage fees. But that gets nuanced, so you'll want to make sure you look at the regs for that. And utility deposits and arrears are also available, and that's paid directly to the utility company, not to the tenant, as the rent is paid directly to the landlord or property management and not directly to the tenant. When we're looking at short-term and medium-term rental assistance, there's 2 terms, and this is very HUD wonky speak, but it's tenant-based rental assistance. That is things that you're used to. You pick a unit out into the community, and maybe it's in a certain neighborhood, but that the rental assistance goes with the tenant should they move to a different unit. Whereas project-based rental assistance is when there's permanent housing units, it's probably in a project or a building, it's going to meet the ESG requirements, and you agree to rent that particular unit, and that they'll reserve that unit for your client and they subsidize it. So should the tenant move out, that rental assistance is still reserved for that project and for that specific unit. I would say tenant-based rental assistance is most common in ESG. When we're looking also at short-term and medium-term rental assistance, it's important to know, and I'll go into more detail to this later, compliance with habitability standards, compliance with fair market rent or FMR, which is adjusted annually and can be found on HUD's website on what those costs are for your community based on the unit size and where you live. And then rent reasonableness, making sure that the rent being charged is comparable to the unit, to the size, the location, the total dollar amount. When looking again at rental assistance agreements and lease standards, there needs to be a legal binding written lease between the owner and the participant for the unit. And the only caveat to that is if you're only covering arrears, that you do not need that. And then project-based rental assistant leases must have a 1-year term for the lease. For rapid rehousing and for ESG assistance in general, you cannot combine it with other subsidies for rental assistance. So you need to ensure that they aren't receiving funding from another public source. And the key word there is public, to make sure that that's not happening. The best example I could share is that if you know someone or you have a client who has Section 8, the voucher, that you cannot receive monthly rental assistance for ESG with their Section 8. Those are things that you can't cover the tenant portion, for instance. With considering late payments, and this has to do with late payments of the service provider, there should be a rental agreement that contains the due date, the grace period, the late payment fees, and then in this case, it would be you, the subrecipient, who has the ESG funding, who is responsible to make timely payments to the owners in accordance to the rental agreement on behalf of the client you've housed. And this has to do with your progressive engagement, what portion of the rent you're covering at what piece is. Should you be late in that, you are solely responsible for paying the rent late fees, and that cannot be compensated with ESG funds. Those penalties would have to come up for another place, in part because it was the agency's responsibility to cover rent. Therefore, if they are late and they're not holding up their end of the lease agreement, they are the ones required to pay for that from a different funding source. When looking at housing relocation and stabilization services, the maximum period of use, you heard me talk about that, is 24 months during any 3-year period of time. The exception to that is case management. That can go for different periods of time. So there is that ability if a family or a household needs stabilization services, that you could step in and reopen case management and not have to provide rental assistance. And then any sort of discretion is up to the state of Colorado, most likely in partnership with your continuum of cares, to set up a maximum dollar amount or a maximum period that's within these regulatory requirements. And if there were any changes of that, Cassie and team would make sure that you were aware of what those were. I think just some key takeaways, if you want to print out this slide or keep it there, it's important to not confuse rapid rehousing and homeless prevention eligible populations. Keep those discrete and serve them based off of where they're at. Keep separate records for each of those components at your agency in HMIS. That will make it easier for you to track that data and ultimately submit it in IDIS or IDIS, and that's done annually. Don't worry, we'll talk about that later. Ensure you're documenting everything. Case notes, what's happening, proof of income, the lease, all of that to show your eligibility. That way, funds are never going to be disallowed if you've properly and appropriately documented them. And ensure, as I mentioned earlier, that checks are not made out to clients. They're always going to third parties, to the entities who either own the rental assistance or own the rent or the unit, I should say, or to the utility company. And then just mindful of best practice in general when you're administering federal funds is to make sure that you're aware of any potential areas of fraud or conflicts of interest to ensure that you don't get caught up into that. I'm going to talk about HMIS. Cassie did a great job talking about it earlier, so I'm going to move a little bit faster through that. So as you already heard, HMIS is a requirement for the state of Colorado and all of you to put your information in to contribute towards your continuum of care's HMIS data. The caveat to that, which you heard, is that your victim service providers and legal service providers may use a comparable database. So somewhere separate, and your lead agencies are going to be designated by your continuum of care, and there's funding available in ESG for them to establish the costs and other things related to HMIS for ESG. Now, this is all because of the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. That's what requires that continuum of care utilize HMIS with capacity. That because HUD wants to be able to see as close as they can, an unduplicated count of individuals and families experiencing homelessness. It requires ESG participates there. There are privacy standards and data standards that COCs and HMIS must adhere to. And the COC that you are participating in may have additional requirements above and beyond what's required by HUD. There might be other privacy factors that your community is considering, and those are things that you can note. They have information that should be published. As I mentioned, the comparable database is for our victim service providers. They are not, and they are prohibited by law from entering client level data into HMIS. Legal service providers can also choose to use a comparable database if that client level data violates client attorney privilege. But still, that comparable database must generate an unduplicated aggregate report based on the data, and it has to be a relational database that meets all of the HMIS data standards and the minimum standards of HMIS privacy and security requirements. If what I just said sounds like Greek to you, reach out to your COC HMIS lead, and they can help you navigate and connect to the right groups to understand your comparable database. Some of the universal data elements, or UDEs, and this is required, required across all components, are on the screen in front of you. However, victim service providers are not allowed to share any personally identified information, such as the name, and they should instead assign a client ID number to the individuals that they serve. Please note that these are the ones that are the data elements required regardless of component, and there are additional reporting requirements by program component, and you can find that information online within the SAGE reporting manual, as well as the HMIS reporting manual for ESG. HMIS costs that you can do is for the hardware, the equipment, the software licenses, phones, fax, what do you need for that? As well as staff time. It takes time to enter that data, and that's something that is an eligible expense. We're putting together the report for the HMIS lead, training staff, overhead, those are all eligible activities under ESG and things that should be considered because data entry does take a significant amount of time. And lastly, the component I'll cover is the administrative component. So the state of Colorado receives 7.5% in admin for its ESG grant to cover the administrative costs. And they have the opportunity to share that with nonprofits, when they are required to share it with units of general purpose local government. You are able to already charge staff time depending upon the component, so that covers a lot of those pieces, but there may be other things that should be charged, and that would be a conversation in contracting with the state of Colorado about what that looks like. The ESG is also eligible for indirect costs. This is your federally negotiated rate, and it needs to be in accordance with 2 CFR 200, the federal grant monitoring. This is, if you have an accountant on staff, have them dig into that, because there's a lot of things in terms of compliance that are important. And these indirect costs can be applied to each eligible activity using the direct cost base specified in your cost allocation plan that's been approved at the federal level. So what that would look like would be your indirect costs plus your direct costs, which equals your total costs, and that's all within your expenditure limit. Some ineligible activities that we found in other communities across the US that people sometimes think can be applied to ESG but are not. So for emergency shelter, you cannot use this funding to purchase a property. You can use it to renovate but not purchase. Funding is not available within legal services as it relates to immigration and citizenship matters, as it relates to mortgages or retainer fees. And then it's also not eligible to use ESG for substance use, inpatient treatment, or detox. Within rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention, you cannot use this funding to cover any of the furnishing or household items for clients. Unfortunately, that's not a part of the move-in costs that are eligible within ESG. You cannot use it for the payment of temporary storage fees in arrears, and then financial assistance to the household for a purpose and time period if they're using another public funding source. So that Section 8 example I provided earlier. You also can't use it to cover other debts of the client, more than 2 months of the security deposit, or any sort of late payment policies in general. Additionally, for the administration, the general management or oversight, and then other project types that are ineligible would be transitional housing and permanent supportive housing. Those are not funded through ESG. That you can look at your continuum of care or other funding sources to support those types of projects. And I want to highlight that this is not an exhaustive list. So please use the ESG regulations when designing your program and the eligible activities and eligible costs, as well as consulting with the fantastic staff at the state of Colorado. So now I'm going to move into homelessness documentation. Put on those seatbelts. It's about to get even more fun. Written policies and procedures. So the subrecipients have to develop, meaning you, and make sure that you're aware of what are the local policies and procedures for record keeping. We want to make sure there's a systematic approach for staff to screen, potential applicants, that there are protocols, and you understand what is required and what backup documentation is required. And just ensure that records are maintained for any person that you assist, including people who you screen and find ineligible. You want to make sure that everything is documented, all of the interactions that you're having with clients are clearly documented, and explains your process too, so that if someone comes in who doesn't understand your program, they can understand why you made the decisions that you made. When looking at homelessness documentation, it needs to be specific to the individual or the family that you're serving, explicit in the criteria that is established as eligibility, and relevant in terms of the time. And HUD's preferred order, it's actually the required order, would be first a third-party verification, second, for this in terms of them experiencing homelessness, second would be an intake observations, and third would be self-certification. So third-party documentation is documentation provided by somebody other than the intake staff and the person seeking assistance. Intake staff observations can be generated for the case file, and then self-certifications would be considered affidavits by the head of household. And your policies and procedures, excuse me, should document that. And just because someone does not have third-party documentation, that does not mean that they cannot receive services when it relates to immediate access to an emergency shelter, receiving street outreach services, or immediate access to shelter services by a victim service provider. It's very important that that is not a barrier to entry to those types of services, that we are protecting the safety of individuals, one, who are experiencing homelessness on the street, but also who could be fleeing domestic violence or other types of violence. And HUD knows that there are nuances to this, and that when people are literally homeless, that it takes time sometimes. So please don't jeopardize the safety of others because you do not have third-party documentation. When looking at ESG and the immigration status in particular, there was the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996. So this is essentially a law that was developed to really state how undocumented individuals are able to receive or not able to receive public benefits, and specifies how this person's status is to be conducted. There are 3 types of assistance that are not subject to the Act's restriction, and that includes activities that are delivering in-kind services at the community level, are necessary for the protection of life and safety, and do not condition the provision of assistance on the potential program participants' income or resources. So how does that apply to ESG? HUD has determined that their following forms of assistance are not subject to the Act's immigration-based restrictions because they meet those previous 3 criteria that I just mentioned. And that includes street outreach, emergency shelter, and safe haven, and then rapid rehousing prior to the annual reevaluation. Those are all services that immigration is neutral on, that you can serve anyone without that. I would also, though, add, like, HUD wants to make sure nonprofits are aware that subrecipients of both continuum care and ESG funds are not required to verify immigration status for applications of federal, state, or local public benefits. That if you are a nonprofit or a charitable organization and you choose not to verify that, you will not be penalized by HUD for those purposes. ESG and record keeping. So record keeping and reporting, we like to start out thinking about the end in mind, meaning at some point, everyone will be monitored, and it's not to penalize, but it's to ensure that the programs are operating according to their intended purposes. And the best way to make sure monitoring goes smoothly is to start with record keeping and reporting. So first, Colorado COCs will develop written policies and procedures for compliance with record keeping and reporting, and that will relate to ESG funds. And there will be certain items that will remain confidential due to client confidentiality. And that will need to be reported either into HMIS, which will then be uploaded into SAGE. That's where that data is reported. And the financial data is uploaded into IDIS or IDIS, which the state will work on. And you submit something called the CAPER, the Consolidated Annual Plan Evaluation Report, I believe. I might have gotten that wrong. And so those are submitted annually, your financial information and your data. And it needs to apply with, or comply, I should say, with the Federal Funding, Accountability, and Transparency Act of 2006. So when you're looking at that ESG record keeping and monitoring, we've come up with a short list of things to make sure are within your files. Any of the documentation around clients that you serve as it relates to eligibility and documentation, and also clients who you chose not to serve because they were deemed ineligible. The client income, your fair market rent and your rent reasonableness, program lease, rental agreements, your confidentiality of policies, what is your grievance and appeal policies? HUD wants to know that you've thought about that and that clients are made aware of those and they're available. What's the assistance that's been provided? The habitability and lead paint as it relates to the units that people move into, any termination documentation that you have, and any sort of client recertification. Those should all be maintained in the client files for whom you serve. When looking at ESG and income requirements, please remember income criteria does not apply to street outreach, emergency shelter, or rapid rehousing until or at the initial evaluation. So initially, people do not need to worry about any sort of income requirements. For rapid rehousing, at the annual reevaluation, they need to make sure that their income does not exceed 30% AMI. Homelessness prevention is really the only direct service where there is income evaluation initially, and they cannot be making more than 30% area median income. And they require 3 months reevaluations within homelessness prevention. It's also encouraged to use their annual income and not their adjusted income. You should be using that. There are some standards within 24 CFR 5.609, but also HUD's CPD office has an income eligibility calculator that is available online. The income limits are updated annually. That is a great way we can make sure that that link is shared with individuals if you are not familiar with where you could find that eligibility calculator. When we're talking about habitability and fair market rate, you need, like we mentioned before, a legally binding written lease between the tenant and the landlord is required for rental assistance within ESG. You may need to have a written lease between yourself and the landlord if you're providing a portion of that rent. Additionally, for habitability standards under ESG, that applies to all of the financial assistance. So that includes rental arrears. You do still need to make sure that you've applied habitability standards, even if you're just applying rental arrears. And you also need to make sure the unit meets both rent reasonableness and the criteria is established under the fair market rates FMR. So just because it meets the fair market rate does not mean the rent is reasonable for that community. You need to do that additional due diligence. For housing and shelter standards, there's a lead-based paint that's required to disclose and to review that for all ESG participants. It's not required for TBRA units occupied by pregnant women or children under the age of 6. And then minimum safety, sanitation, privacy standards are required for ESG funds as it relates to emergency shelter for the building, rehabilitation, conversion, renovation, shelter operations, and permanent housing. This slide for the housing and shelter standards lists the minimum shelter and housing standards categories. If you want to read all of them, they can be found at 24 CFR 576.403B. The biggest difference between HQS and these standards is that fire safety requirements are more stringent for habitability, but otherwise these standards are equal or looser than HQS. And it's acceptable for recipients or subrecipients to use HQS standards, but they also must document compliance with the higher standards for fire safety if that's what you opt to do. For 504 self-evaluation, which predominantly relates to your emergency shelters, this is on Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 that relates to it being unlawful to discriminate based on disability and federally assisted programs. A self-evaluation is required by both Section 504 and promotes the inclusion of programmatic and project-specific alterations to ensure long-term compliance with accessibility for the program, for your services and activities. So to make sure that your physical building is accessible, that your program materials and services are accessible, if people need that in a variety for their disability, also though if they need it for other language compliant reasons, that needs to be covered. And also when doing this self-evaluation, it's highly encouraged to include persons who have disabilities. Just like in other areas, we want to include persons with lived experience. That's essential in this type of an evaluation. I'm not going to read all of these areas. These slides will be available to you to see the steps of that self-evaluation process. But I think one thing to be mindful is the fact that a policy or practice might appear neutral where it's written, how that is, but there could be discriminatory effects on individuals with disabilities. And that's why this evaluation is conducted, as well as including individuals, so that way you can really ground truth to make sure things are as accessible as you want them to be. And the last thing I would say on that is whatever records that you have related to 504 self-evaluation, please maintain them for at least 3 years. I'm now going to talk about duplication of benefits, or DOB, for shorthand. So a duplication of benefit occurs when a person, a household, the government, an entity, someone receives financial assistance and they're getting them from multiple sources for the exact same purpose. And that total dollar amount they receive is greater than the total amount that they actually need. So for instance, let's say one person needs rent and they somehow get that covered from a family member, a faith-based group, at ESG, and their rent is $1,500 a month, and altogether they got $2,000. Well, that means that they now have duplication of benefits. They've received more funding than they need for their rent. But it goes broader with that. When we're looking at the OBM cost principles, really what you want to make sure is that it's necessary and reasonable for the performance of the federal award. So you've done your due diligence to make sure that this funding is covering the eligible activity, the program standards, and the actual need for the assistance. And it should not exceed anything above and beyond. So I've put together a really high-level slide with things to consider with your case managers as you're working through this. Did they assess the client needs and determine what other funding sources may have been used to pay all or part of the cost? Calculate that maximum award or the unmet need, and then document it. So for instance, in that example of if a household's coming to you for homeless prevention assistance and they've received funding from a faith-based group for $500 of their $1,500 rent, document that. If you can get a copy of the email or what that looks like, put that in your file, and then you can cover the remaining $1,000 without concern of duplication of benefits, as an example. I'm now going to discuss match. So the regulations offer a much more specific detail on how to calculate match, how to maintain those records, and you can find that at 24 CFR 576.201. But here are some high-level things that you should be keeping in mind. It's important just to keep that. Match isn't something people think about every day, so just brush up on that as you go through. But remember that regardless of the source of the match contribution, the use of that contribution must be on an ESG eligible activities and in a compliance with the ESG program rules. And match may only be used or counted as match one time. So for example, if someone donated a building and you're using that as match, it can only match the obligation grant, let's say for fiscal year 2020. But even though you're using it in 2021, you have to only use it for 1 year. Can't go for fiscal year 2020 and 2021. On the next slide, we cover some more things for you to think about. Program income can be treated as match. And remember, I think one thing that for folks to think about is matching funds are based on your total grant amount, the total amount of ESG you have, and does not have to be provided on a component basis. So for instance, if you receive a shelter outreach, an emergency shelter grant, your match just has to cover that total dollar amount and doesn't have to be one-to-one based off of the components you're receiving funding for. And some examples of things that are not considered as match, SNAP benefits or food stamps, because those are being used to cover your client's costs, their food. Any sort of housing choice vouchers that are awarded because those pay the public housing authority's obligations under the housing payment or the HAP contract with the owner. And also another example would be with the tenant's portion of the rent, because that's the tenant's obligation. So those can't be used as match within your program. And with that, that was quite a lot of information, but I hope you were able to follow that and were available for more questions. Let me throw it back to Cassie.
Thank you, Erica. That was a lot of information, and that's going to help hopefully many, many, many recipients for years and years to come. So thank you so much for the work that you've been doing on this PowerPoint. Just to Erica's point, we don't have specific contact information here just because we want to use this webinar for as long as we can. So I was trying not to date it. I am about to date it. We are in 2020 right now. Just to reiterate what we said at the beginning, a lot of the nuances specifically around things like the area median income and the reevaluations, a lot of those are waived right now because of COVID. Again, with the ESG CV funding, some of those regulations are different as well. Big one being you don't need match for ESG CV. So please know that this webinar is just about the regular ESG funding between probably 2020 and about I would say end of 21, probably depending on how COVID plays out. We do have some additional flexibilities there too. So please feel free to reach out to us, ask us those questions. We are going to be providing more webinars and technical assistance around what that looks like. We know you get a lot of that right now, so we're trying to keep it as minimal as possible. But we would rather you ask us and let's work through it together than have to clean something up or to correct something that was done incorrectly. So please feel free to reach out to us. Instead of putting contact information, we're putting just the Colorado DOLA ESG website here. This is going to be your resource for any upcoming applications or renewals or previous webinars or any of that stuff is going to be on this webpage, as well as staff contact information. Another thing that's going to be on this page, and you all are hearing me now as you have access to this, we're recording through this page. Underneath the link for this webinar will actually be a quick Google form. If there are additional areas that you would like us to dig into deeper, additional things you have questions about, things you want TA around, TA being technical assistance, anything like that, there is a form on our website where you can go and just quickly tell us what that looks like. We are here to help you all do this work. Again, thank you for the work that you're doing. You all are the ones who are out there, boots on the ground, helping move people into housing. And that's what we're here to support. So it's been about an hour and a half now, so I will end this webinar. But again, please feel free to reach out to us. Let us know what questions you still have about ESG, and thank you for what you are doing. And with that, we will call it a wrap. So thanks for staying with us, and we will talk with you all soon.